Let me introduce you to Black Moon Lilith. She's probably one of the most feared positions in astrology, or misunderstood ones. Some people describe her as seductive, destructive, rebellious, manipulative, the dark feminine, something that can't be controlled. But I think most interpretations in general are either black and white and doesn't really capture the essence of what we can learn from Lilith in general, on a psychological level and an archetypical level. And I think the times that we live in right now, with the rise of the feminine fire, in many ways calls for a reinterpretation of the misunderstood archetypes of the dark feminine. And it's very interesting because in my own work, when I look to Black Moon Lilith, I've seen that this is one of those placements that tends to travel through generations on the maternal line. Whenever there is a Black Moon Lilith that is interestingly aspected or have like a certain degree that is recognizable in a chart, I always start asking about the mother line. So today I will introduce you to what I call the 3 stages of Lilith. Stage number 1 of Lilith is what I call the suppressed version. The suppressed version builds up resentment. Stage number 2 of Lilith is the rebellious phase, the outcast, but also the one that tends to become destructive over time. And then the 3rd stage is the most important one because it's the integrated Lilith, where the feminine power have met its shadow and is now cutting away everything that isn't freedom. And before we go deeper into the 3 stages, I would just like to introduce you to the astronomy of Black Moon Lilith. I take you on the journey of Black Moon Lilith, astrologically and symbolically. It's important to understand the astronomy of Lilith, because she's not a planet, she's also not an asteroid, even though you can find an asteroid called Lilith, but this is not the same. So Black Moon Lilith is actually a mathematical point, and it's where the moon is the furthest away from Earth. What can confuse some people sometimes is that there are 2 ways of calculating Black Moon Lilith. The first one is called mean Lilith, which is more of a smoothed and average position, and this is the one that most astrologers use because it moves in a steady pattern. However, there is also another one, which is called true Lilith, or the interpolated Lilith. And this is a more instantaneous position of the lunar apogee, and it can move both forward and backward because the moon's orbit is just wobbly. So now that you understand the astronomy of Black Moon Lilith and know that this is a point calculated in the sky, we can move on to the astrology and the myth, because in order to understand this placement in a birth chart, we understand how Lilith was portrayed through myth so that we can understand the psychological influence, and then that way around understand what she stands for in a birth chart. So let's dive right into it. So part number 1 is what I call the suppressed Lilith, the Lilith that also builds up resentment. So I always say that if we are going to understand Black Moon Lilith astrologically, we first need to understand where she comes from. And the answer just isn't quite as simple as many people think, because you might have heard the traditional story that is on many platforms about Black Moon Lilith being, Adam's first wife. But it's quite interesting because Lilith was originally not mentioned, or historically not mentioned, in the book of Genesis. In fact, she develops over centuries. We find some references to Lilith in many female-like spirits when we go to the Mesopotamian cultures, especially the Sumerian and the Akkadian and the Babylonian traditions. We see versions of Lilith where she was associated with the night. She was also associated with the wild and the untamed feminine forces. And then much later in Jewish folklore, particularly when we look to medieval texts that is called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith becomes known as Adam's first wife, and I think that's the story we hear the most in a simplified form. but it doesn't appear before the medieval text, just to take a note on that one. So according to that story, Lilith were actually Adam's first wife, and they were created both from the earth, so they were actually equals, which is an interesting note to take. And then the story goes, or the folklore goes, that when Adam demanded Lilith to submit to him, she refused because she insisted that she was equal to him. And whether this story is historically correct is really not the point. The interesting thing is that astrology doesn't use mythology because mythology is history. We use it because we want to understand the human mind, we understand the psychology, we want to understand the undercurrents of what it means to be having this human experience. And I think looking to mythology is very interesting for that. We don't always need the historical facts to see patterns. And so I just want to really state that out, that the simplified story that we get, that Adam and Lilith were together in the first version, actually does not appear in the Genesis historically. It is a folklore, a myth that is developed much later on. But if we again look to the version of Lilith that exists in what I call this first phase, I would say that, her knowing that she was created as an equal and needed within this marriage to Adam and being with him to fight for her own independency and her own, not wanting to submit to him, especially sexually, as it was described in many myths. I find that to be such a truth about how we come into this life knowing that there are no limits, but we are being put into situations that creates such limits upon us. And one of the things that can create in the human psychology is definitely resentment. So that is why I called the first phase of Black Moon Lilith is the phase where you try to adjust, you try to suppress yourself, you build up resentment over time because perhaps you are not being treated as an equal, which is also many ways the story of the feminine in today's world and what we see happening. So that is Black Moon Lilith in part number 1, and I will tie all the knots together, but let's now dive into part number 2 of Lilith. Looking into the second part of Lilith is also very important because it's the part that is highly recognized as the one where she's exiled from the garden, but it's also the part that I call the rebellion that tends to become destructive over time. So basically, after she refused several times to obey to Adam's wish, she was in many myths explained as she was being outcasted and exiled from the Garden of Eden, and also in some religious versions she became a demon who was eating children, getting children just to punish Adam and then kill them in front of him, and all of these horrible images that, these stories are very old about women being demonized for wanting to be equal and free. But if we just look to what that can tell us when we understand the Black Moon Lilith placement, I think it's interesting to look to the mythology, because now she's exiled and on top of it she's being demonized. And in some versions you could say, yeah, but this is the rebellious version of Lilith because she is going against the grain. She will, she seeks revenge, she will not be silenced and all of this. But the shadow side of it as well is that it can really, really dive deep into a karmic pattern where you build up so much rebellion in the name of justice that it becomes destructive. So I always say that if Lilith stays in this phase for too long and identified too much with being the exiled, the outcast, then it becomes very destructive, because now the karmic circle is only about getting justice and only about revenge in the sense of getting justice. And now all of the power that actually lies within Lilith herself is being she's sort of using all her power to rebel against the image and the demonization of her, instead of using that enormous anger and that power to utilize and create a fire within her that might put her on a different path. And I think when I look to many interpretations of Lilith as being destructive and misleading and manipulative, I think that is very much describing this phase number 2, because there are parts of the human psyche that can stay in this victim consciousness. And, even if in the beginning of the story it was rightfully so that you have these feelings of revenge or rebellion, later down the road, if someone stays in that consciousness, again the karmic loop just repeats. And that's definitely what, in my eyes, are happening if you have what I called an unintegrated rebellious part of Lilith in your birth chart, because she will create enormous havoc and a lot of resentment built up through even lineage generations on the maternal side. And the reason why, for instance, I see in many birth charts people who are born as females and who have difficulty with the family of origin, what I see a lot is that there is a very uncanny pattern in regards to Black Moon Lilith, where there are certain patterns, whether it might be the degree in which Lilith is in, or the zodiac sign in which she's in, or the aspects, the specific planets that she communicates with in a birth chart, that seems to be on a repeated loop. That's where it starts to become very, very interesting, because this is the melting pot between mythology, astrology, history, and the evolution of mankind. So just to sum this up, to understand that first, Lilith was not described originally in the Genesis, even though many people describe her now as the first wife of Adam. That was not common knowledge before. That was sort of also that where mythology starts to reveal new versions of what it means to be human, and where the human consciousness is at. So the first layer was to understand, well, Adam had a wife before Eve, and she tried to be his equal, and it didn't go so well. The second part, again, is now the story about the feminine that has been, treated poorly and exiled, and then on top of it being demonized, but then staying in anger and resentment and repeating karmic loops. And I think looking at part 1 and part 2 of Lilith can also very much explain why there are so many black and white interpretations of Lilith. And now let's move on to part number 3. So now where this gets really interesting is when we have reached the level number 3 of what I call Lilith, the integrated version. Lilith in her true freedom. Lilith as someone who's able to pinpoint every point in which you are not truly free in yourself, and where you have created prisons that maybe once were justified but no longer are helping you on your evolution on this journey in your human body. And so to bring this point down is that I see that a lot of the reasons why many people fear Black Moon Lilith is that they actually fear the mythological stories that are very human about either, having to adjust to be loved or being exiled for being different. And that is such a split that exists in every single human being, because we are all wanting connection, we all wanting to be, loved and seen, but we also want to be authentically ourselves and have an expression that is, individual from everyone else. And so the integrated part of Lilith is the part where she will stop and she will say, what did I learn when I was in the Garden of Eden? First and foremost, I might have learned that suppressing my true desires in order to stay in conformity just doesn't work for me. And at the same time, I have a wound in regards to being rejected by the person that I love when I'm fully myself. And then she will also ask the question, in regards to the second version of her, which is that when did I become destructive on my path of breaking free? When did I continue to just repeat karmic loops when in actuality that doesn't serve the higher purpose anymore? So those are some of the questions that I will always bring into fruition if I read a lineage chart and focus on Black Moon Lilith, because whether you identify as a man or female or non-binary, whatever it might be, we both hold both 50% feminine, 50% masculine energies. And those energies are having, they both have a shadow and a light side. And if we don't balance both, there can never be peace. There can never be a sort of alignment with who we truly are. And therefore, I also find Black Moon Lilith to be such a pivotal placement to work with in a birth chart, to open levels of consciousness that you might not have been able to reach before. Now we have a new framework of working with Lilith through 3 stages. And that's what's so beautiful about astrology, is an ever-expanding interpretational art form. So whenever you gain new perspectives, new insights, it can unlock versions of your birth chart that you might not have been able to reach before. So let's say an example of how you can work with Lilith is that you can, first and foremost, I would highly recommend you to go to your own chart, look to which house is she placed in, are there any peculiar aspects, does she communicate with any other planets, what degree is she in, and just start there. Look at the zodiac sign she's in, obviously, as well. And start to look at your life from a fresh perspective on where might you have felt resentment in your life, where have you allowed circumstances to suppress you, which side of yourself have you not unlocked in a way that feels authentic to you. Another part is that perhaps you have gone completely over in the other side of Lilith and you have been very rebellious or freedom seeking, and then you found out that you have actually made your own prison cell in the name of being a rebellious woman or man, because this is something that very often happens because we live in this world of duality. We tend to learn through duality, which is we go in one extreme then to another extreme, and then we always seek to kind of try to find the middle point. So an integrated Lilith placement is something that I think all of us could continue working on for the rest of our life, whether you are masculine or feminine, because it is also a new frequency that is coming in this moment of time that I like to call the rise of the feminine fire, that allows us to gain a level of consciousness that makes us see archetypes, and especially misunderstood female archetypes, through a new lens, where the former suppression and perhaps even attempts to misinterpret the wild feminine is now being, I want to say it's outdated. It doesn't work for us anymore on a conscious level of humanity. So that's where we need to begin to be more flexible with the interpretations that are already established. And before I go too philosophical about all of this, because I could literally just go on a rampage right now, I will leave you with the 3 stages of Lilith, and perhaps a new understanding that she is not a planet, she's she's not an asteroid, but she's a calculated mathematical point in the sky, and that from my lens and my research, she has 3 stages that can help us become more aware of how to integrate displacement, that can hold a bit of a trickster energy, but only because you might not have integrated the shadow sides that she holds within yourself, and therefore you are not as free as you could be. You have imprisoned yourself. So that's just a little bit of a side note. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you would like to work with me, I do have different offerings. They tend to change depending on how much time I have at hand, so check the description box below, and I hope to see you in another video. Bye for now. Bisous.